as a New Yorker. If he's all about cost of living, why is he in favor of rent control then? Because there's a huge literature on rent control. There was just a study last year, that a meta-analysis of over 100 studies of rent control since World War I, and it finds, obviously, yeah, rent goes down in the rent-controlled apartments, but rent goes up in the market housing because you're restricting supply, right? And this is an extremely well-studied phenomenon. There's a pretty wide consensus about it among economists. And so if I'm for cost of living as a voter in New York, what I want to see is a mayor that says, we're going to build a lot more housing. Perhaps we'll do housing subsidies for people that really can't afford it, sure. But in general, the only way to bring down the price in the market rentals, which is half of rentals in New York, is to build, right?
Well, one thing I would contest is I think there's broad consensus across the political spectrum right now on the need to construct more housing, including market rate housing. I think there was broad bipartisan support for the City of Yes proposals in New York City. And I think often the left is at the forefront of battles against the interests of local homeowners and others who want to prevent new constructions. So I think for those who have been pushing for those sort of thing, before, it's worth just like celebrating the change, celebrating that I do think there's a shift in perceptions from across the political spectrum on the question of market rate housing. I think Zohran's program includes a lot about how to make housing construction easier and faster. I think if you look at the other left or center candidates, someone like Brad Lander was responsible for the rezoning of the Gowanus area, which was one of the best recent examples we have of creating new housing in the U.S. Or in New York City, I should say. But so in general, I'm all for whatever we can do to create more housing. When it comes to rent control, I think rent controls can be designed poorly or well. You can imagine me creating a rent control program that says, okay, you get to build a market rate, housing complex, and it's going to cost you X amount. This is roughly what your ROI is going to be, and there's going to be rent control on a portion or maybe all of that building that you're constructing, but it's only going to kick in after 25 years. Now, you can imagine that's actually how a lot of well-designed rent control programs have been built, as opposed to poorly designed ones. And you can imagine some sort of like minor market distortion later, but on the offset, it's a lot less market distorting than me saying to you, you have to invest all this in housing right now, and you're going to get a meager return, even though your money could be making, double digits, and if you just lock it in an index fund, you don't have to deal with any of the headaches. So all I'm saying is that there's different varieties of rent controls. I'll concede that some are extremely poorly designed.
It's a bit like saying, having 10 drinks today will give you X amount of hangover, but having 2 drinks in a year will give you much less of a hangover. Why if you're worried about hangovers, just don't drink. In other words, your argument is less rent control further in the future will distort the market less. Implicitly, you can see that rent control distorts the market, and that's bad. So, why not just not do any of it?
Well, I believe in interventions into the housing market, and the interventions come in many different forms. So even what you're describing, pumping taxpayer funds to subsidize some people's entrance into the housing market, that is a distortion as well. I do think that the primary way in which we reduce costs is the construction of new housing. In my view, that construction should be both private and public. So we can look at examples like Singapore, or I keep drawing back to Sweden, but Sweden, I think, is a really useful example for New York, because at a time that the population of Sweden was around 9-10 million, right now it's around 12. So roughly ballpark the size of New York City. There was a program to build 1 million housing units, and those 1 million housing units were built by the public sector. In Singapore and Hong Kong and other places, in which land is very scarce, the state plays a really big role constructing housing. This is obviously distorting to the market, but only in the sense that it's creating new supply, which is a downward pressure on the private market. So I'm all in favor of interventions in various forms. I do think there's ways in which one could design better forms of rent control, but primarily I'm about building more. And I think that there has to be a role for really well-designed public housing that's aimed at primarily the middle class, the middle 60% of people seeking housing, and not aimed at the poor and those that would struggle to kind of pay rent and maintenance fee. Because in fact, we have stronger public programs if we focus on that middle 60%. Then we could figure out affordability programs for those kind of falling below a certain threshold.
So if I look broadly at American cities right now, or over the past 10, 20 years, it's easy for me to think of examples where policies in the DSA camp, whether that be rent control in a place like San Francisco, where there was a study in 2019 which found that it actually increased rents by 5%, as modern economic theory would predict. It's easy for me to think of examples like that, where a DSA policy made something worse in a major American city. We could go into defund the police too, but that's not necessarily philosophically socialist. It's just there's been a correlation of that over the past few years. It's hard for me to think of examples where like a hyper-capitalist policy has destroyed a city. And so when I look at the cost of living problems in New York, the public safety problems, to look at all that and say we need to push more in a DSA direction, I see very little to justify that general attitude.
Well, I think it's kind of a little amorphous to say DSA direction. I think we look concretely at the national level. What a lot of Democratic Socialist politicians have focused on have been issues like Medicare for all and reducing not only increasing access to healthcare, but also reducing certain sources of health costs. And I think that's very sensible policy. I think it puts us in line with other industrial nations. When I think about broadly like the DSA milieu's solution to housing, I see today at least a three-pronged approach that is in favor of upzoning, so making it easier to create private supply, is in favor of public housing, which is obviously more rare in the U.S. environment for someone to mention, but that's a distinctive contribution, and is favored of some stabilizations and controls. And I think as long as it's being married with supply generation, I actually don't think that in the abstract there's something wrong with stabilization and controls. I actually think it could be a healthy complement in certain ways. It's just really a question of
giving with the left
design.
hand what you take away with the right hand, because
that's a lot of ex post redistribution is like that too. You know,
it's just very very well established that rent control reduces the supply of housing, right? So if that's a concern, then why not just do basically what economists recommend, which is no price controls. And if we have to do subsidies, we'll do subsidies, because that's a market intervention that isn't quite as bad as price controls.
So, but even on this question of rent controls and stabilizations, in the example I gave, I said, imagine if you were a housing developer and you knew that you were making an investment and you needed a certain return on investment. Mm-hmm. And the control was built so that after a certain set amount of years, the controls kicked in. Mm-hmm. To me, that might even have the benefit of encouraging more construction after that set amount of time. You know, obviously it creates a certain tier in the housing market of people who have access to this controlled housing. Mm-hmm. But to me, that's no more distorting than us subsidizing a group of people who have access to affordable housing through tax dollars.
Why would that subsidize more building? I'm confused.
Well, I mean, I think that at a certain point there will still be the kind of demand being generated in the for more housing. there's no reason why a housing development corporation that just successfully made X amount of dollars off a housing development would just stop then because they're getting less long-term 20-plus year returns on an investment they already recouped a good return on.
Right, but once the rent control does kick in, all the effects of rent control are it's not that the only bad effects of rent control are prospective for the builder. It's also accumulates as the rent control simply exists. So, for instance, you have an apartment, you're paying $1,000 a month where the market rate for that apartment would be $3,000, right? You're never going to leave that apartment, right? Like that will become a golden prison for you because it's in Midtown, it's in some great location. You're going to hold on to that apartment your entire life at a much higher rate than you normally would, which means if that were a market apartment, that would be on the market once every 3 years, right? It would be vacated every 3 years and it would be on the market, increasing the supply of housing. If it's rent controlled, it'll never be on the market, right? So that restricts the supply and still increases rent in the rest of the market. So you still get that effect regardless.
So advocates of rent control would say that the stability that engenders is good for communities and neighborhoods and so on. That's actually part of the design of their program. What I would say is my main concern with certain forms of rent control is if the amount being paid is too low to actually maintain properties.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be on the lookout for that. I'm less concerned about these other things. I would also be on the lookout for rent controls where it's designed in such a way that it makes it less profitable to build housing. I think there's many forms of. Obviously, I have a normative objection to capitalism as a socialist. I could think of a million more capitalists that I have more of a problem with than people trying to build housing. I want it to be a clear rules of the game so they know they could go in and do this thing with as little red tape as possible and the ability to make predictable returns. All I'm saying is that it's not necessarily the case that a rent control or rent stabilizations like we have in New York City would make this impossible if we're at the same time reducing other regulatory hurdles towards building housing and if the programs are designed correctly. And I think in general, the Zohran Mamdani campaign's promises around housing is much more in sort of the pro-market but redistributive sphere than
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine a Zohran Mamdani would be 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one case where I feel like the discourse or the criticism of the liberal left hasn't really caught up to where a lot of the liberal left is today on this one particular issue.
You may well be right. I assume maybe you pay more attention to what Zohran says day to day than I do, but I've heard him on podcasts recently complaining about the level of profit that landlords make, right? And it's like, you ask him about housing, he doesn't sound like you. He sounds a lot more like someone who believes the problem with housing is that landlords are making too much money.
So if you gave me a particular quote or soundbite.
That was on the Derek Thompson podcast within the past few months.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be up for thinking about or critiquing. I'm not a party line person.
Mm-hmm.
Even Zohran Mamdani on any one of these issues. In general, I think I was describing where he is now. I think there's a host of issues when he's talking about cutting red tape for small business owners, like bodega owners, and
Mm-hmm.
he's doing campaigns. There's a lot of the rhetoric that is not quite as regulatory as you would expect
Mm-hmm.
from Zohran Mamdani, and maybe we're just focused on different breadcrumbs.